The dog's claws hit metal before the sun even cleared the tree line. Clink. Wesley Talbot spun around so fast he nearly dropped the fence tool in his hand. His dog, Ranger, a red and white Australian shepherd mix with more gray on his muzzle than he used to have, was digging like his life depended on it, dirt flying, tail rigid with focus. Wes jogged over, sweat soaking through his shirt in the brutal afternoon heat, and knelt beside the hole. A rusted piece of metal, some kind of pipe fitting, buried inches beneath a patch of grass that had no business being green in a field this dead. Before you find out what Ranger really dug up, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story gets stranger than a rusted pipe. And drop a comment. Would you have paid $10 for 31 acres nobody else wanted? Because that's exactly what Wesley Talbot did. And on that scorching afternoon, staring at wet soil in the middle of a drought, he had no idea he was about to uncover something that would turn the whole county upside down. He touched the ground beneath the metal. Wet. There hadn't been real rain in weeks. He crawled 3 feet over and dug again, bone dry. Back to the pipe, wet again. What in the world? Wes muttered. Ranger trotted 20 yards off, nose to the ground, and started digging again. Clink. Another piece of buried metal, another patch of damp earth in the middle of a field everyone said was dead. Wes stood and looked out across all 31 acres of cracked, sun-baked ground. Something was down there. Something nobody, not him, not the county, not any of the 3 men who'd owned this land before him, had ever figured out. Months later, Dale Mercer, the most successful wheat farmer in the county, would lean against Wes's fence, look out at rows of green Wes had somehow coaxed from that same soil, and offer him more money than he'd ever seen for the north 20 acres alone. Wes would say no. Dale would raise the number. Wes would say no again. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because on the day this story really begins, Wes didn't own a single acre. He'd spent his whole adult life working other men's dirt, fixing fences that weren't his, repairing irrigation lines that fed someone else's crop. He knew everything about farming and owned nothing to show for it. His grandfather used to tell him, "Bad ground and forgotten ground aren't always the same thing, son." His grandfather had farmed rented land his whole life until debt and a few brutal seasons ran the family off it. Wes wasn't chasing riches. He just wanted one piece of dirt where nobody could ever tell him the lease was up. So when a 31-acre parcel showed up at the county tax auction with a description that read like a eulogy, abandoned agricultural parcel, no active irrigation, severely degraded soil, Wes was the only person actually looking at it. The well was dry. 3 separate owners had tried and given up on it over the decades. Wheat, then sorghum, then nothing. Opening bid, $10. Dale Mercer, standing nearby in a pressed shirt, caught Wes staring and couldn't resist a laugh. $10 will buy you lunch, he said, loud enough for the room. That field will just make you hungry. A few people chuckled. Nobody else raised a hand. Wes raised his, sold, $10. Of course, the $10 was just the beginning. Taxes, fencing, cleanup, equipment. He hadn't bought a working farm. He'd bought 31 acres of problems with a $10 entry fee. But it was his. He started small. Fixed the fence wire by wire, hands bleeding by week's end. Spread compost. Planted sorghum. Some came up, most didn't. The ground soaked up water like it was starving, then dried out again within hours. Dale drove past sometimes, rolling down his window. "Still worth 10? "Still mine," Wes would answer, not looking up. But the bills kept coming, and owning land was starting to feel a lot more expensive than working someone else's ever had. Then he noticed the green patches, small, stubborn strips that stayed green long after everything around them turned to dust. Ranger loved lying on them in the worst heat. More than once he came back with mud on his paws, even though there wasn't a drop of surface water anywhere on the property. Wes dug beneath one patch, cool, slightly damp, 10 feet away, bone dry. Another patch, cool, moist again, and that's how we caught up. To Ranger digging up that first rusted pipe. Whatever was buried under this field wasn't random. It was a pattern. If you're enjoying this story, smash that like button. It genuinely helps this video reach more people, and you do not want to miss what happens next. Over the following days, Wes marked every spot where Ranger dug or the grass stayed unnaturally green. Stake 1, Stake 2, Stake 3. By week's end, the stakes formed 2 rough parallel lines running the length of the property. He dug deeper and found more rusted metal, a corroded pipe joint, several feet of old agricultural pipe. County records showed no irrigation system had ever existed on this parcel. So who buried it? And where did it lead? He followed the line for days, digging through collapsed sections until he found an old valve assembly. He cleaned it off, gripped it, turned. Nothing. Turned again. Nothing. He grabbed a wrench, put his weight into it, and felt something give. A groan traveled through the pipe. Then, water. Muddy at first, then clearer, then a real flow. Wes laughed, disbelieving. For the first time since the auction, this felt fixable. But Ranger wasn't celebrating. He kept sniffing further downhill, refusing to come when called. Wes repaired what pipe he could reach, and within days, water was reaching part of the field for the first time in 20 years. He planted a test plot and watched, holding his breath each morning. Green shoots, then more. Cars slowed down on the road beside his property. Dale pulled up to the fence with no joke ready for once, just stood there studying the rows, then drove off without a word. For a few golden days, Wes believed he'd solved it. The field wasn't cursed, it was just missing water. Then, before the sun was even up, crack. Wes bolted upright at the sound. By the time he got outside, a section of his field had already caved in. Then another. Water burst through the earth, and his seedlings disappeared into churning mud in seconds. The ground sank into a long trench. No! No, no, no! Wes sprinted for the valve barefoot, but by the time he wrenched it shut, it was too late. Water carried his topsoil straight toward the road. Ranger stood safely uphill, barking. County workers arrived that afternoon because mud had reached the roadside ditch. The line had to stay shut until the drainage issue was corrected, an issue Wes didn't even know existed. Someone photographed the ruined test plot, and by the next day, half the county was laughing again. Dale didn't need to gloat. He just said quietly, "Some ground got abandoned for a reason, Wes." That night, Wes sat outside his shed staring at the wreckage, doing math that made his stomach turn. Walking away suddenly felt like the only sane option. Comment below. Has there ever been a moment in your life where quitting felt like the smart move? Wes was one bad night from giving up completely, but his dog wasn't done yet. The next morning, Ranger went straight back to the trench, but instead of digging near the steel pipe, he moved uphill and clawed at a different spot. "Ranger, no, not now," Wes snapped. Ranger ignored him and pulled something loose, dropping it at Wes's feet. A curved, reddish piece of material. Wes thought pottery at first, then recognized the shape. Clay drainage tile, but the pipe he'd repaired was steel. Why were there 2 completely different systems buried under the same field? Wes carried the tile into town, and someone pointed him toward Harold Keene, a retired county soil conservation technician. Harold turned it over in his hands. "Old subsurface drainage tile. Haven't seen a piece of this in years." He drove out, examined the steel pipe, the soil, the clay fragments. "You didn't just find an irrigation line, son. There were 2 systems here. Steel brought water in. Clay tile pulled the excess back out. Whoever farmed this ground wasn't just watering it. They were managing the whole water balance underneath it." "So what happened?" Wes asked. "Drainage failed. Water sat near the surface instead of draining off. Salt built up. Kills crops slow, not fast. That's why nobody figured it out. Eventually everyone just assumed the ground itself was bad." "Where does the drainage empty out?" Wes asked. Harold shook his head. "Old maps don't show it. That part's on you now." They traced clay fragments for days, Ranger following cooler strips of soil and rodent burrows alongside the buried tile. The line pointed toward the lowest corner of the property and vanished. No outlet, no ditch. Then, the weather radio brought worse news. A severe thunderstorm headed straight for the county, several inches expected. His field was already unstable. If drainage stayed blocked, The storm could wash away everything he had left. He had 4 days. Subscribe now if you want to see how this ends, because what Wes and his dog find next changes everything. Wes worked like a man possessed, reinforcing the trench, building diversion berms, laying straw over exposed soil, keeping the valve sealed. Day 1, nothing. Day 2, more clay fragments, still no outlet. By day 3, clouds were gathering low and dark. The evening before the storm, Wes realized Ranger was gone. He searched, panic rising, until he heard frantic scratching near the old cottonwood at the field's lowest edge. Ranger was buried beneath the exposed roots, digging hard. "Ranger, easy, easy." Wes dropped down and cleared dirt with his hands. Brick, stone, then a cavity. A stone-lined opening emerged beneath the tree, packed with roots, rotted leaves, broken tile, decades of sediment. The outlet. Finally. Wes wanted to tear it open immediately, but Harold grabbed his arm. "Not so fast. Release all that trapped water at once and you'll get the same collapse that wrecked your crop the first time." So this time, Wes listened. They cleared a small opening. Waited. Cleared more. Waited again. Water began moving, slow, controlled, right as thunder rolled in the distance. Rain hit hard within the hour. Water sheeted across the field. The berm slowed it, but the outlet wasn't moving enough. The water kept rising. The road sat downhill, waiting. "It's not enough," Wes shouted over the rain. "Then we make it enough," Harold shouted back. Soaked through, they worked by flashlight while Ranger huddled beneath the truck, whining at every thunderclap. They hit the biggest obstruction yet, a thick root mass woven through collapsed tile. Wes cut into it, waited. The soil held. He cut again. Water surged violently, and for one terrifying second, Wes was certain he'd repeated his worst mistake. Then the flow steadied. Instead of exploding across the field, the water disappeared into the restored line, controlled, exactly where it belonged. Wes stood in the pouring rain and laughed, shaky with relief. By dawn, the rain had weakened to a drizzle. Wes walked his property, half afraid of what he'd find. The road was untouched. The field hadn't washed away. Across the damp earth, the storm had revealed faint raised lines stretching in every direction, the true shape of a drainage network running under nearly the whole property. For the first time, Wes finally understood exactly what he'd bought. Over the following year, there was no overnight miracle. Wes rebuilt the field section by section, compost, cover crops, only the irrigation he could manage, drainage restored piece by piece, marginal ground left to grass. His first real crop wasn't huge, but it was profitable, enough to cover the bills, pay the taxes, and keep going. One afternoon, Dale's truck rolled up to the fence again. He studied the healthy green rows stretching across ground he'd once called worthless. "I'll give you a real number for the North 20, he said, "more than fair." Wes thought about the auction, the laughter, the $10, the dead sorghum, the trench that nearly swallowed everything he had. "Not for sale," he said. Dale nodded slowly, then asked something nobody expected. "Would you show me what you did?" Wes opened the gate. Later that season, after harvest, Wes walked out to the very first green patch with Ranger, limping slightly beside him, older now, slower, but still leading the way. Wes knelt where his dog had first started digging and pressed his hand into the soil. Cool, dark, moist. Everyone assumed Ranger had dug up something valuable buried beneath a worthless field. In a way, he had. It wasn't gold, it wasn't treasure. It was the first surviving piece of a forgotten system built by farmers who understood that difficult ground doesn't need to be conquered. It needs to be understood. The field had never been empty underneath. It had been quietly carrying the remains of the very thing that once made it thrive. And that $10 hadn't bought Wesley Talbot 31 acres of dead dirt. It had bought him 31 acres that everyone else had simply stopped listening to. If this story hit you the way it hit us, make sure to like the video, drop a comment telling us what you'd have done in Wes's shoes, and subscribe for more stories like this one, because the next one might be even harder to believe.